All right, so the paper I'm going to be presenting is titled Scribble 2D5, Weekly Supervised Volumetric Image Segmentations via Scribble Annotations, which is a mouthful, but really the core idea is being able to accomplish valuable and useful segmentations on 3D image volumes using just scribbles as annotations instead of pixel-wise annotations. So the motivation for this paper is that image volumes, or like a bunch of image slices that all correspond to like a singular 3D object, it's a really common thing in the medical world between like MRI and CT scans, and being able to segment them to help highlight problem areas or abnormalities using CV techniques is really valuable to medical professionals. The problem with training these kinds of architecture, this kind of computer vision architecture, is that for strongly supervised segmentation or labels, it takes a really long time because a medical professional has to go through and label each pixel that correspond in each slice of the image throughout the entire image volume, which takes a really long time. Unsupervised methods work fine. They work better than you'd expect for not having any kind of labels at all, but it's not well enough to be viable when we're talking about like diagnoses for people or highlighting tumors or something like that. So this is intermediate, or kind of in the middle. It's a weekly supervised, where the idea is you have incomplete or rough segmentations. There are a couple kinds of this. There are bounding boxes, which are really rigid and not that useful for the sort of complicated objects you might see in an image volume. There's also extreme points, where instead of having to highlight a whole bounding box, you click the leftmost, rightmost, topmost, and bottommost part of the thing you're trying to highlight, which again isn't very flexible, which is why the authors of this paper propose scribbles, which is just pencil sketch marks, like a regular scribble on a piece of paper, but over the part you want to segment. You don't have to highlight the entire thing, which makes it really easy for medical professionals to do. So on top of proposing a network that is capable of getting state-of-the-art segmentations in terms of weekly supervised methods using just scribbles, they also propose these standalone modules that can help improve the quality of segmentations done anyway, and a way to propagate labels given in like a 2D space throughout an entire 3D image volume. And kind of jumping ahead, the network is cool, but I really think these modules that they came up with are really ingenious. So part one, as you can see, this image is really complicated. It has a lot of moving parts, but I don't think any of these parts individually are all that complicated. So I decided to break it down bit by bit. So first, we're going to talk about this backbone network. So the related work for this backbone network is UNet. I'm not sure if who all is familiar, but the general idea of UNet is that it's a fully convolutional neural network where there are two paths. There's the regular contracting path of a neural network that we're probably all familiar with, where via convolution and pooling, you work downwards towards a very like rich feature space where the features are representative of a high receptive field. But instead of stopping there and continuing to flatten and then using softmax, they do more convolution, and then they do upward up convolution and depooling or deconvolution to sort of scale back up from this rich feature space into a higher resolution. And they do concatenation with the higher resolution features, because features at higher levels have really good local representations or local receptive fields, and the the features in lower levels have much better receptive fields. So by concatenating these two together, you get better indicative features of the image. So Scribble 2D5 built on top of UNet, where the change they made is instead of doing 2D convolution throughout the entire network, they do 2D in the earlier layers and then 3D convolution in the later layers. And they also add these attention blocks. They do spatial attention within the image volume to find attention between pixels or elements in each feature map. And then the result of each of these layers is fed forward into various respective modules. And now we're going to talk about some of those modules. So the first module is a label propagation module. It's used to generate pseudo ground truth, where it's not quite exactly what would be generated by dense annotations, but it's close enough. And the idea is you get like a boundary to a segmentation, like the edge part of the segmentation, based on doing edge detection on each of the 2D image slices in the image volume, and then connecting those edges. And you also get segmentation labels, where this is the actual body or the inner part of the segmentation, where given scribbles, which might be on like the top of the image volume, you then use Slick or some other form of k-means clustering to cluster together related pixels based on intensity of the pixels and distance, how close the pixels are. So by doing that, you can draw scribbles on like the top part of the image volume and then connect each pixel together into like super voxels. Okay, after the label propagation module, there's also a static boundary prediction module. The point of this module is to detect that like unmoving outer edge part of the segmentation. So it's based on this related work, weakly supervised salient object detection via Scribble annotations, where the key takeaway from that paper, the key takeaway that the authors of my paper used from this other paper, is that you take feature representations at a bunch of different resolutions of the image similar to UNet. You concatenate each of them together here, and then you do cross entropy loss of the output of that concatenation versus ground truth boundaries given the label propagation, well, given edge detection, because they used 2D images in this paper, but we had those 3D edges we found via label propagation. So all this is doing is you're taking feature representations of your image, you're concatenating it all together and then combining it via these channel attention blocks and convolution. And you're comparing your predicted edges, which should be better due to the quality of combining them together with combining different levels of richness or receptive fields together via this concatenation and upsampling. And then the predicted boundary map here is passed into this static boundary loss here. So this capital B is the static boundaries, the boundaries we'd have via the label propagation module. And this log B, tiny b, is the predicted boundary or edges. All right, so next is the segmentation boosting module. This one is more complicated than the other two, I think. So I broke this individual part into multiple other parts. So this first part, I'm going to talk about this Atris spatial pyramid pooling block. So the related work here is dense ASPP, which is Atris spatial pyramid pooling. It's a mouthful, but all the motivation of this is that you want to take an image and segment it, but segmenting within it, if objects within the image are at various scales, can be complicated or not that robust. So to add robustness, instead of just using one version of the kernel, they take some convolutional kernel and they dilate it to varying degrees to increase the receptive field of that kernel, so it learns to be scale invariant, or at least robust in terms of scale. Here you can see that like you take a feature map, you do this dilated convolution and you pass it or concatenate it with every other dilated convolutional kernel result. If you come back here, the authors of the paper don't do as much propagation or as much concatenation. They claim that it was to cut down on the number of parameters, so to shrink the model size, but they said it didn't result in too much loss in terms of performance. So on top of the dense attribute spatial pyramid pooling, there's another related work for the segmentation boosting module, and it is this paper, Learning Active Contour Models for Medical Image Segmentation. So the idea here is that you want to regularize the predicted segmentation based on some understood appropriate size relative to the total size of the image. So you're regularizing the area of your segmentation to prevent it from covering too much. So it's really helpful with preventing over segmentation of an image. So here they're given some loss function for active contour loss, which is 2D. It's the total length of the image plus the region within the segmentation scale monitored by or scaled by some parameter. And here you can see like a more detailed mathematical breakdown of what each of these terms are, the length and the region. This is the UX and UY are the calculated boundaries or the gradient in the X direction, so horizontal, and the Y direction, which is vertical. And that's for each pixel. Whereas this region, this C1 and C2 are constants used for something different in the active contour loss, but for our paper, which works in 3D, C1 is the predicted mean image intensity within the focused on region. C2 is the mean image intensity on the outside of the segmented region we currently care about. And V is the ground truth, the image is actual value. Okay, so now that those related works are covered, we can talk about the actual architecture of our model. So there's some initial segmentation mask, MNIT, which is generated by performing convolutions on the result of the dense attribute-spatial pyramid pooling block that we implemented. So that gives you an initial guess at what your segmentation masks are. You then calculate loss relative to the 3D pseudo mask that we generated via the label propagation module. So using the clustered supervoxels from the Scribbles, we use that as our ground truth. There's also a third mask they introduce, mvoxel, to restrict loss calculations to only voxels where there's one predicted class, because due to overlap in 3D images and the way Scribbles may propagate, something may be predicted as 2 classes. So to help speed up calculations of loss and get it to converge faster in early stages, they only factor in the voxels that are predicted as a singular class. After calculating this segmentation loss for the initial mask and calculating this initial mask, this MNIT is further processed into mfinal by factoring in predicted boundaries from the static boundary prediction module, which I can show you here. So given this static boundary prediction module where they estimate where the boundaries for your segmentation should end, and given this ASPP block where you get your initial prediction for the segmentation, you further do convolution and channel attention block and concatenate together to get a final prediction. So you can see the result of, or this mfinal, this final segmentation mask, now factors in the predicted boundary for the segmentation. So you have this minit and mfinal, which is the same, takes the same structure as this loss, this segmentation loss, except with mfinal instead of minit. Lastly, there's an active boundary loss term, which follows the footsteps of the active contour loss, except it's now in 3D. So there's the entire surface or the outside of the 3D region you're attempting to segment, plus this volume within the image, guided by this volume within the segmented region that you care about, guided or weighted by this hyperparameter, plus this hyperparameter times the volume outside the segmented region. So again, we're just trying to normalize or regularize the predicted segmentations. For the paper, they said that this lambda 1 was set to 1 and lambda 2 was set to 0.1 to heavily emphasize making sure that the area within the segmented region is kept as small as possible while not hurting the segmentation performance. So just trying to really prevent over segmentation. So with all those modules accounted for, the final loss function, to put it all on one screen, is this boundary loss guided or weighted by some hyperparameter, plus the segmentation loss of the initial mask, plus the segmentation loss of the final mask, plus the boundary or the active boundary loss weighted by some hyperparam. The authors of the paper stated that both of these hyperparameters are set to 0.3 to control the weight of these loss terms. So now that the architecture is established, I can talk more about the experiments they conducted. The data sets they used were these three: the automatic cardiac diagnosis challenge data set, where they use sine MR images from 100 patients with segmentations provided for left and right ventricles of the heart, as well as the myocardium. And the segmentations were provided by experts, but they were just scribbles. For this vestibular schwannoma, I think that's how you say that word, data set, it's MRI images from 242 patients of tumors. The annotations here were pixel-wise, and the annotations for this chaos data set were also pixel-wise. The chaos data set is T1 weighted MR images collected from 20 patients or subjects, images of kidneys, livers, and spleens, again, with this pixel-wise annotation. So for the sake of the paper, this ACDC data set was fine because it's has Scribble annotations that they could use, as well as being accompanied by ground truth for comparison. But for this VS dataset and the chaos dataset, there were no scribbles. It was densely annotated. So what they had to do is a process called morphological erosion, where they take the given segmentation mask and use some series of convolution, I guess it would kind of be, where they check for some structure, and if the structure isn't there, the pixel is entirely removed. So it's just trying to trim down the segmentation to its minimum representation. So they trim down these dense pixel-wise annotations to a 1 pixel skeleton throughout the entire image volume. And now here's just configuration for the way they tested the images. All volumes were 224 by 224 by 32. One channel, because they are intensity images. If a volume was too small, they would leverage zero padding. For an optimizer, they use Atom. They used weight decay of 10 to the -7, initial learning rate of e to the -4. Training took 6 hours over 200 epochs on 130/90. So it actually doesn't take that long to train, which I thought was pretty cool. And now for the results, I just used table images, and I'll talk about them a little bit. So the metrics they opted to use were DICE to measure similarity or overlap of ground truth segmentations with predicted segmentations. They used Hausdorff distance to compare the distance between the predicted boundary and the ground truth boundary. And then they used precision, kind of similar to dice, but they just wanted to really focus on making sure that the positive segmentation portions of their predictions aligned well with the positive segmentation portions of the ground truth. UNet PCE and MAAG are both weakly supervised architectures, and you can see that they really blow them out of the water with their full model architecture. And here are strongly supervised 2D UNet and 2.5D UNet, where it still outperforms this weakly supervised method, but the gap is much closer across all three data sets, as you can see. This in extremis architecture uses the extreme points I mentioned at the beginning. ACDC and Chaos don't provide, or didn't provide, maybe they do now. They didn't have the extreme point annotation, so they couldn't use this model for those two, but here you can see how it performs on this data set. They also performed this ablation study to compare how their model, the Scribble 2D5, does without each respective module. So here, without the label propagation module and with the other two, and without the static boundary prediction module. Interestingly, this without the static boundary prediction module also removes the active boundary loss module. I wonder why they didn't do one that included the other two and only removed this static boundary prediction. And here are just some samples of images so you can help you visualize the performance and compare the segmentation performance to the other architectures. And here you can see how each of the modules helps inform the segmentation compared to a ground truth. So strengths of this paper, I thought, first and foremost, I really think that the ingenuity of the modules, I really like the idea of the label propagation module and the static boundary prediction module and the segmentation boosting, because it felt really scrappy or resourceful, I guess, to use every part of the image you're given to sort of make up for a lack of strong supervision or dense annotations, particularly the idea of using edge detection to figure out the boundaries of a segmentation to help inform that segmentation. I thought was really clever. I hadn't heard of that before, but I think it's a really cool idea. I think that the explanation of each modules were really helpful to understand what they were for, and I think the provided configuration of parameters makes it easy to replicate their found performance. However, in terms of weaknesses, they only trained or demonstrated the model on one image modality, which is MRIs. So I'd be curious to see how it performs on like CT scans and PET scans. Additionally, they didn't explain the reasoning for the B1 and B2 hyperparameters, and they didn't show tests for varying values of the hyperparameters, which would have been interesting to see. For instance, on this table here, you can see that without active boundary loss on this ACDC dataset, the precision is actually higher than with active boundary loss. And I'm wondering if some tweaking of that B2 parameter, the one that weights active boundary loss, could have been useful there. Like if you tweaked it down from 0.3 to maybe 0.2 or something. And lastly, it's not as much of a weakness as it is more of a question or a future experiment, which is why not 3D convolution in the early layers of the architecture. So if I go back here, you can see they use 2D convolution. The reason given that they gave was that they wanted to do anisotropic convolution, and all that word means, I didn't know that word before the paper, is that each pixel in the image volume they want to treat as unique and give their own unique value via convolution. So using 2D convolution, you'd get a unique value within each of the kernels for each pixel. And they said that 3D convolution is usually used with isotropic image volumes, or image volumes where pixels all share the same weight. However, I was thinking about it and I thought that image volumes generated from videos, where each slice in the volume is a frame, are anisotropic, and I think 3D convolution is really common for processing videos. So I wasn't quite sure if I followed their reasoning for not using 3D convolution. So I'd be curious just to see how the model performed if using 3D convolution versus 2D in the early layers. And overall, I think I'd give the paper a 2. I really, really like the idea of the modules. The network itself was interesting and it performed well, but I think the modules portrayed a lot of like ingenuity and creativity, which I liked a lot. So I'd advocate for this paper to be accepted. And that's the end of my presentation.